Hi, Shweta Vikram. Welcome to the podcast today.
Hi, Krista. I'm so excited to be here, and thank you to everyone who's listening.
Yes, thank you so much for coming to the podcast. I'm excited to talk to you today and unpack your very important work and the book that you just published. So my first question is always, I'm going to pass it back to you. I'm going to allow you to introduce yourself to the listening and watching audience on YouTube and let them know a little bit about who you are and what you've been doing.
Sure, I appreciate that. And this version keeps evolving with every conversation. So I like that. Hi, everyone. My name is Shweta Vikram. I'm an Ayurvedic doctor and author of 14 books, a speaker, an educator, and I help people live on their terms and lead a life where there are no excessive boundaries. Whether it comes to this, a lot of my focus is around emotional and mental well-being, because from an Ayurvedic perspective, most diseases start in the mind. And how we think impacts how we feel, will impact how we eat, all of that. So yeah, everything health, wellness, and balanced lifestyle, no extremes, is me.
Yeah, beautiful. The second question I've always left in, I'm just always so curious. This is a spiritually based podcast. It deals with the intersection of personal development, healing, and spirituality. So I'm always curious about what were you plunked into as a child in your belief system? And then obviously you do Ayurveda, but what are you leaning into your practices as an adult? If you can walk us through that story.
Absolutely. I grew up in a Hindu home, and I was raised between three continents: India, North Africa, and then the United States. So,
Oh, wow.
yeah, and both my parents were Hindu. So I saw my mom, less dad, but like more mom was more religious, and dad was religious from a very pragmatic standpoint. So am I. It's an inner practice,
Mm-hmm.
and we have our beliefs and things that we do. It doesn't have to be outward, but I do honor the traditions. And now with both my parents gone, I think it's a way to keep them alive. But what was interesting was I saw my nani, that would be my maternal grandma, my mom's mom. She would do the japamala, and that stayed with me because as I got older and I started meditating, and occasionally I would do the japamala, and I was like, oh, it's incredible. I'm a big believer in sort of introducing and exposing your kids to different experiences, because you don't see when they start to find themselves, they don't necessarily have to go out. They might
Right.
be able to tap into the memory. And my dad's side, my grandmother, oh, she had an incredible memory. I mean, if she was raised in different times, today she would have been like a CPA somewhere. So there was religion, but there was also pragmatism, there was
Mm.
creativity, there was spirituality. And my dad and I talked a lot about spirituality and patriarchy, and how religion sometimes can be misinterpreted depending on economic strata of people. So I was very blessed because I was raised with, on one hand, like I'm a big Ganesh fan. So for
Me
those,
too. I love him.
right. And my mom was like, why Ganesh? I was like, "Yeah, he's a food god. I mean, how do you not love a foodie?" But over a period of time, it's also, there's a sense of ease and safety. And
Mm-hmm.
to me, religion is more a sense of grounding and humility, where I bow my head down every morning after I shower, and to be able to say that gratitude, and to remind myself there's someone way bigger than any of us, right? And even
Mm-hmm.
on the hardest days, even when I'm upset, like you lose a loved one, you're angry, you're upset, you're in denial, all of that, there is a place. And to me, religion's also that safe space of just going there and being like, what the heck? Why did this happen?
Mm-hmm.
Human beings might not necessarily always have an answer to that, and you're not seeking an answer. So I
Yes.
think for me, it's in that intersection of religion and spirituality. Is also, my dad would also say humanity trumps all of that. So
Mm-hmm.
you can be doing 500 japamalas, but if you're cruel to people, no religion teaches that. So it's
Right.
humanity, and then religion and spirituality come hand in hand. But I also realized, Krista, that all of this keeps evolving as I get older, wiser, I lose family members. So some traditions are like this year I started to do Mahavir. There's a Hanuman, he's got the monkey god, but my
Mm-hmm.
teachers get very upset when we say that. But he is an epitome of strength, courage, resilience, and my dad
Mm-hmm.
believed a lot in him. So I found myself like going to a temple and praying to Hanuman, and I felt, oh, that's a way to connect. So I think
Mm-hmm.
religion also becomes a part of your healing journey when it's an inward thing. Again, like I said, for me, it's not
Yes.
outward. It's me doing a one-on-one, sitting and in a temple and just finding that sense of peace.
Mm-hmm. I think Hanuman is making a big comeback and more mainstream now because of the Monkey Man movie that was
Oh yeah.
unbelievable and incredible and had such like the richness of that movie and all of the layered ideas of even what you're speaking to about there, which is like the evolution of spirituality and religion and the patriarchy and all the things. So I love that you said that too, and provided so much detail there. I really appreciate that and completely agree with everything you said back there.
Oh, thank
So
you.
you're here today because you've got a new book, but before we get into the book, because I do want to talk about Ayurvedic healing and things like that. I haven't had somebody on the show for a few years, so I thought maybe we just explain to them what Ayurveda is and like this sort of the main principles of it, and how we would incorporate that into our lives on a regular basis, and then we'll get into your book.
Okay, absolutely. So Ayurveda is the science of life, simply put. So it's a living science. How you eat, how you live, how you breathe, how you are in connection with other human beings, your community, all of that is Ayurveda. A lot of people think, oh, it's just about herbs. Like, oh, let's take
Right.
ashwagandha and like deal with their anxiety now. It's literally all of this. So it's honor. Ayu means life and Veda is science, so it's the science of life. And nothing is prescriptive in terms of being forever. So when I work with my clients and I'm working on the diet, I'm like, this is for the next 3 to 4 weeks. We check in after that, and if there's an improvement. So what I mean by that, it's a science of permission and not
Mm.
deprivation. It's not like never look at sugar. I couldn't do that. I love my desserts. But when I know there is inflammation or there are other things going on and maybe I need to cut back, my mind works really well knowing, oh, it's only for 3 4 weeks.
Mm.
Right. So with everything with Ayurveda, it's about permissions and what your body needs in the now. It's also honors elements so like TCM, Chinese traditional Chinese medicine. There are
Mm-hmm.
different elements that TCM recognizes, but in Ayurveda there are 5 elements. It's air, ether, fire, water, earth, and it's the combination of these, like a pair, that leads to 3 doshas, which is your constitution. Think of it as your DNA. So at
Mm.
the time of conception, the dominant dosha that a mom has and the dominant dosha that a dad has will become a child's dominant dosha. So what I mean
Okay.
by that is like my brother and I, even though we are siblings, our doshas are different because at the time of conception, during his time, my mother's dominant dosha was something else, and so was my dad's versus when it came to me. So it's unique. It's like your DNA. No one else, even though two people could be pitta kapha or pitta vata or vata kapha, whatever have you, it's still unique. The
Yeah.
proportion, there are sub doshas, and so all of that will differ from individual to individual. The proportion of even fire to earth might differ in a person.
So I guess so does your dosha not stay static then? It's dynamic throughout your life, or do you when you're born it stays static?
So it good health means it being static, but
Okay.
falling sick means it's out of balance. So
Okay.
yeah.
Okay.
So when the constitution is what you're born with,
Hmm.
and the imbalances are what cause diseases.
Okay. I don't think I actually knew that because I have done my dosha before and I thought I was thinking it was something that changes like over time or as environmental impacts and things like that.
Yeah, no, but you're not wrong. It does change, but that's the imbalance, like not the
That's
core.
the
So,
imbalance.
so
Okay.
when we think of summer season, which is upcoming, and it's
Hmm.
pitta, people who are predominantly pitta dosha, they might feel the effects more. So they need to be a little bit more cautious and conscious about, let's not like pursue a pitta aggravating diet and lifestyle. But even a kapha person, which, they have no like fire in that sense, but if they
Yeah.
lead a very pitta aggravating lifestyle during pitta season, they can go into imbalance. So the vulnerabilities are more for someone who's dosha, like the basic constitution is
Right.
pitta primary. But anyone can go. It's like I have very little vata, and every fall I go into vata imbalance. It's New York is windy, and it's like it gets to the bones, and that's my
Right.
vulnerable point. So yeah,
Okay,
yeah,
gotcha. Thank you so much for explaining that. I
of
really
course.
appreciate it. I know it'll help people as we get through these questions. So you wrote this beautiful book. I got a digital copy in advance. Thank you for sending that. It's called The Loss That Binds Us, and it's written in the form of 108 Marma points that correspond to the 108 points distributed out throughout our body, which I thought was such an interesting and beautiful way to, put all of this information together. I wanted to first ask you, in terms of grief, there is such a, here, especially in the West, I don't know what you have to say for in Asia, but like, there's such a weird vibe around grief. People have such a weird relationship with grief, and we still really struggle to communicate with people who have endured grief or are in the middle of grief or are struggling with their grief. What do you have to say about normalizing grief in our shared human experience after writing this book?
I love this question. And I say that because I wrote this book because my dad wanted me to write it. And I wrote it after he passed away. Because he would always say, and I was very close to him, that we need to normalize grief. It's such an inherent part of life. Death and grief don't spare anyone. Yet we have so much resistance. There's taboo, there's shame, there is. I've been, I know somebody who was shunned by her friends after a death in the family because they thought it was contagious and it might happen to them.
Wow.
Yeah, so people, I think, are inherently very insecure and scared. Most people. So instead of trying to explore and understand what this grief could represent, they're like, if I don't deal with it, then it won't touch us.
Right. If I don't have to come into contact with it, I'll be fine.
It's not a contagious disease. It's a reality of life. And I've realized my grief has made me so much more empathetic. Like I have people come to my grief workshops or my book reading events, and they'll be like, you lost your parents. I just lost a cat, and I was like, it's not just a cat. If your pet was meant like a family member to you, your loss is your loss. So I think the other thing to normalize is to not compare grief. There shouldn't be a hierarchy of whose grief matters more, or the childishness around if it's and grief could be a response to any kind of loss, right? End of a friendship, loss of a job, opportunity, marriage, any of that. So even competing over that is so petty about which grief is more important. Like it completely depends on your situation and your relationship to that loss. If that job, like I met someone who came to a workshop, this woman had worked at a job for 3 decades. End of a job is end of her identity to her.
Yes.
So, how do I say, oh no, I lost my dad and my grief is important? No, your grief is. So I think just people need to have a little bit more empathy. And I have a very dear friend, and I always give this example of hers that, when the reason I wrote this book was because after my dad passed away, she was like, I don't know what to say to you because I've lost both my parents. And, she has both her parents. And I was saying to her, I really appreciate you asking me this instead of giving unsolicited advice. Because when grief is raw and fresh, nobody knows what they need. They might need a cup of coffee one day and they might want to punch somebody else in the middle of the afternoon. So there's an inner reaction going on inside you on a cellular level, psychological level, physiological level, and just someone saying, I'm here for you. I am not, you're not invisible. I see you suffering, but just let me know what you need. Versus there are also people who are the token people, right? They'll message you once or send you flowers once or come see you once. And it's a check. Oh, I've been there for the griever.
Right.
So people to just have a little bit more, humanity in their hearts, because just to remember, even if you're not that incredible of a human being, just remember, there is no way around grief. Everyone is going to be impacted by loss. And the sooner we realize how vulnerable we are without anxiety or fear, I think it just makes us kinder.
Yes.
And because, with grief, years after, there could be a trigger. So even a message, it doesn't have to be like a basket of fruits. No, just a text, like I'm thinking of you. That can make the person feel really special. Like in my case, both my parents are gone. So there's this sense of identity loss, right? Sense of invisibility. Who am I? What do I mean to others? All of those questions. And when someone ghosts you, even if it's unintentionally, you're like, oh, I really am invisible to people. So all of that, I see you, I feel you, I love you, was only valid until such time my parents were around. So grief is so nuanced and complicated. Just asking people, what do you need? And it's a text message, nothing more. That could be very helpful.
100% to all of that. It is so nuanced. It is so complicated. There is no hierarchy. Yes, yes, yes. All of that. I also think it's interesting too in our culture. Sometimes there's this idea of like once you get to that year mark of somebody being passed, it's like this invisible moment that people sort of tick in their mind that like I don't need to check on anybody about this. But like you said, like it can be ongoing. I know for me when I had my first big grief moment, I had like delayed grief. Like it was
Mm.
almost like the shock of the death was sort of too hard for my system to acknowledge. And then about 6 months later, it was like my grief hit me like a freight train. And that was such a strange experience to have and realize like, whoa, this is so delayed. It came out of nowhere and I don't know how to deal with this. So I appreciate you going into that level of detail. I wonder, since it sounds like from reading the book, like you had such a wonderful relationship with both of your parents and they were very important to you. What do you have to say for people who are experiencing grief for relationships that were very hard in their human form? I know a lot of people like this, and I'm not just talking parents, I'm talking like friends and, coworkers and partners and things like the whole spectrum of if we don't have a good friendship with somebody and they pass away, sometimes that grief also feels very complicated. I wondered if you had anything to offer there.
Oh, yes, absolutely. And, that there's a lot of guilt,
Yes.
remorse. And I've heard this from clients and friends. And it's hard. The first thing to remind yourself is you did the best given the situation and the relationship you shared.
Mm.
And what people talk about are just highlighted reels of their lives. Like even in the book, I talk about the nuance. Like my dad and I, we were very close, but being close also means you're at loggerheads. We had similar personalities, so we had clashes, we had cold wars, all of that. So relationship is never ever smooth, and we are made to believe like everything literally has to be a highlighted reel and hashtag living my best life is the only truth. No one lives like that. So for anyone who's listening to this conversation, even I was blessed that I had a really good relationship with my father. Even then, there were hard days. So for someone whose relationship is estranged, right, whether it's a sibling, a friend, a parent, whatever have you, it's unfair. It's unfair to you. It's unfair to them. No matter what caused that, it's unfair because when the end happens, we all want closure. And then,
Yes.
we are digging into our memories to find those good memories so the anger doesn't linger on. So I think the first thing I would recommend is start with self forgiveness.
Mm.
That's I have a very dear friend, and she had a healthy relationship with her mom, but her last conversation with the mom was her mom came back from a party and wanted to gossip about something, and she was like, I'm too tired. Why do you go to these parties? Like, why are you bothering me? It's a typical mother-daughter conversation. Next morning her mom had a heart attack and she passed away. So my friend still carries that guilt.
Oh,
So you see,
wow.
it could be a healthy relationship, and all of this is, when I say healthy, I'm using air quotes because all of this is relative, right? But in her mind, she carried the guilt. And then when we met, I was like, no, you have to be true to yourself. If this is how you felt in that moment, this is how you felt. Right. And so for people who were estranged from a friend, the mind will take you to different places. It'll trick you into believing you were at fault. There is guilt. It'll trick you into believing only those good times that you can tap. Before anything gets bad, it's good at some point, right?
Right.
Allow yourself all of that, because I think the trouble starts, and again, I'm not a psychotherapist, I'm saying everything from a holistic perspective. The trouble starts when we are not true to ourselves, when
Mm-hmm.
we take on the pressure of this is what guilt should look like, this is what and I can say this with an example. Like my father and my father-in-law died 2 days apart unexpectedly, right? So we were
Wow.
dealing with two losses in our families, literally exactly a year ago. And it was very clear with my husband. I sat down and I said to him, there will be no comparison. Let's not compare. Your relationship was different. It was more traditional. Doesn't mean he didn't love his father, but it was more traditional. Mine was more a buddy system. So, like, the
Mm-hmm.
mind will always constantly, that's the job of the mind. Don't believe everything your mind tells you. It's, yes, I feel your pain if something was estranged, and we've all had estranged relationships, but forgive yourself first. You did the best knowing what you could do, and life happens much as it. And every now and then you'll have those regret modes. I still go into them. I wish I could have done this. But then I have to remind myself, take a deep breath. I did the best knowing whatever I had in the moment to give, to be able to show up. And that's about it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and you even address in the book that grief sometimes will bring the worst out in you, or you're like your shadow side. And I think sometimes when we're experiencing grief, or people around us are experiencing grief, because it's just so raw, and it hits a part of our own internal, vulnerabilities, like you said, so deeply, and that even in those moments when we're trying to deal with our own grief, we can lash out at people, or we can say the wrong thing, or we can push people away.
Right.
I wondered also if you had anything aside, from like just being self-forgiving and compassionate. Is there anything else that we can tell people how to be gentle with themselves, even when they sort of lose their footing in trying to deal with their grief?
Um, a few things that worked for me was I was eating very mindfully. It's very
Mm.
easy to sit with a pint of ice cream or a bottle of scotch and just say it's justified. Life sucks right now. The thing
Yeah.
is, no one is coming to save you. That let's be very real. No one is coming to save
Yes.
everyone.
1,000%.
Adults are very self-consumed, including all of us, and
Yes.
we are so jaded by our own lives that we forget what it's like to be kind on a deeper level, not just once, but continued kindness, right? So you have to take care of yourself.
Mm.
Um, Hurting yourself is not going to bring back the person or the relationship and opportunity, right? Even alcohol, there's no judgment from my end, but again, like when grief hits you hard, there will be the temptation. So maybe a couple of days it's fine, but like ask yourself what's becoming too much, so don't let that become a habit. Most important is moving your body. It's when the grief just hits, like there might be people around, there's a wake happening. In our case, there's cremation happening. I had no, obviously, I couldn't say I'm going to the gym when there are like two deaths happening, right? But I would walk up the stairs because most others wouldn't. That gave me my space to think what I needed. Always, take an extra shower, like spend 20 minutes extra in the bathroom to check with yourself what you need. But even
Hmm.
more importantly, even if you have one or two people, your confidants, and they don't have to be in the same room, be in touch with them. Just let them know this is how I feel. People who will not use that information against you. Right. And so,
Yeah. Taking care of yourself just in those little ways is everything.
absolutely. And it's because what happened, the reason I emphasize on people who won't take advantage of you is, when we are vulnerable, anyone who seems to want or pretends to hold space, we share. And not
Right.
everybody is looking out for you. They might not have any bad motives, but they're not looking out for you. But then we have these expectations. Oh, I shared, but they didn't show up. So to
Hmm.
not go down that rabbit hole of expectations, being let down, being vulnerable in front of, and I think Brené Brown says that, and I'm completely paraphrasing and butchering her eloquent quote, but it's about like one needs to be really smart about who we are in front of, who we are
Yes.
vulnerable in front of, because the wrong audience could turn that into shame and the right audience could help with the healing. So being
Hmm.
mindful, like always, you don't need to wait for grief to strike to have a supportive network.
Correct.
So
Well,
build.
and it's like the other thing is that we often want to believe that our friends have all of the right tools and capacity to support us, family and friends, and in truth they don't. So when you're being discriminating about who you're going to be vulnerable, that's so important, because if you know you need something specific, like you said, that you'll have an expectation hangover if somebody shames you or they don't show up. And so it's important to I think what you're getting at there is being very mindful in the support you seek during the grief process, right?
Absolutely. And also mindful with your self-care practices, like how you eat, how you move, what you drink, is no one else can tell you how to do that. And it's extremely important, especially when the grief is raw, because otherwise
Yeah.
patterns become habits, habits become addiction. That's the scary part.
Yes.
And also,
That's the slippery slope.
that's a slippery slope. And even with friends, some friends mean well, but like I have friends who are great human beings, but they shut down in terms of crisis. So reaching out to them when I'm undergoing
Right.
crisis, I'll get nothing. And then what happens? Friendships end because my expectation would be, oh, you didn't show up. So I think being discerning from day one about, okay, this is a great friend to go watch a movie with, but this is a friend I reach out to when crisis hits, or this is a friend I talk work with. Like putting that pressure, and I say this about relationships as well, like romantic relationships, don't put that pressure on your partner. They're not your therapist.
Yes.
So the other suggestion would be, talk to a grief counselor. if you feel you need that. Whether it's, for some people it's grief counselors, for some people it's therapists, for some people it's journaling, or it could be a comment. For me, writing is the biggest catharsis. Like in writing and writing and writing, then one day I was like, oh, I don't want to write about this anymore. And that's when I know my healing has started. Not finished, it started. I don't think it ever gets done, because depending on where you are in life, the intensity increases or decreases. Like I was in India last week, and going back to India the first time after all these deaths. And here I used to go every quarter to see my dad. So that my relationship with India has changed. So while I thought I
Right.
was doing great, all of a sudden I'm hit with grief. So just be
Mm.
prepared. The intensity might decrease over a period of time, but you have to do the work. No one can do it for you, but it doesn't really go away. So anyone who's trying to tell you you'll be okay, they're lying to you. You'll be okay is just relative, and you learn
Yes.
to accept this new version of you.
Yes, I agree with that wholeheartedly. I think grief never leaves us. It just sort of it takes on different shapes and shades and intensities, and I think it kind of always sticks there. We can't really, and it's hard because you can't replace the grief, the people that have lost and things like that. So I wondered in terms of looping in the Ayurvedic standpoint with the grief and how you would tie those two things in together. If someone had that practice, like how could they use Ayurveda to support their grief process as well?
I love that question. And I say that because, I hear, and I'm sure you've heard it too, we've all heard it. As adults, there's no one who's escaped grief, and there's no one who's escaped criticism and judgment, right? So I
Correct.
would hear this very often. It's unfortunate. At a young stage in life, I've lost both my parents, right? But I've always heard, like, oh, how do you have your, pardon my French, your shit together? And it got me thinking, why is that one sulking? Why is that one on the couch and not doing anything? How is it somebody else is a doer? Oh, how come you don't
Mhm.
have anxiety? The other person is anxious. So people, the only way they make sense of anything, including grief, is by comparing. And for me, Ayurveda is that compassionate living science that explains everything. When you are high pitta, which is me, I'm a doer. I'm
Yeah,
great in terms
you're
of
action oriented.
very action oriented, but there's also a downside. Burnout is very high. So having those mindfulness practices about rest, about slowing down, like for me, the way I grieve or heal is pouring myself into work. And then I also have to remind myself, oh, you know what? Something doesn't feel okay. So that awareness really helps. So
Yes.
recognizing, and at the same time, not judging a kapha imbalanced person who's not motivated to move from the couch, right? Or a vata imbalanced person who's so anxious they can't say 5 sentences together without losing their cool, or their mind feels so scattered. So the minute Ayurveda comes in, you understand people for the imbalances, and all of a sudden you become more compassionate. That's not them, it's the
Hmm.
imbalances. But I this is something that I talk about a lot, Crystal. Like grief turns people into monsters. It does to
It
all of
does, yeah.
us. But I think with something like yoga and Ayurveda, it teaches you how to channelize that energy. Because, like,
Hmm.
as a Pitta person, my go to will be anger, but anger will
Mm.
burn me out. So I have to acknowledge that, oh, I'm action oriented, I can get stuff done, but I might be stuck in the anger phase of grief, versus
Right.
a kapha person might be stuck in the depression phase. So
Hmm.
Ayurveda is not just handy when it comes to being compassionate and understanding how each person is responding to the grief, but it's also in terms of self care. Like, I am not going to be under motivated, knock on wood, let's not jinx it, because it's not because I'm special, it's I'm a pitta person, right?
Right.
But at the same time, a kapha person might not be, they keep procrastinating for 6 months since they lost a loved one. So it's working on those imbalances. So how do we bring down the kapha, bring up a little bit more pitta, bring up that clairvoyance or spirituality through vata, so they can also thrive in life. So I think
Hmm.
that's the beauty of Ayurveda. Again, like nothing is forever. It's how you work. It's a living science. It works with you and for you.
Yeah. Yeah. I think just, yeah, being mindful of the imbalances. I know in the first time, like I said, when I experienced close grief, I went, and I'm very action oriented as well. And so like I did go into like a depression, and I think going through that first one, I just sat still, and it wasn't until like I realized when we kind of had close back to back deaths in our family, and then it was like once I got to that second one, I was like I realized I had to throw on the music and move my body because otherwise I was just going to sit in my sadness. And again, no shame and no judgment about that. But it's also like, for anything to do it for extended periods of time is just, it's not healthy, whether that's overworking or underworking. Life is about balance, and it's about finding equanimity in all things, and especially the grief process, and finding that like compassionate other inside of yourself to be able to pull yourself out of something is really, really important to do this work.
I agree. And I think the other problem is the world we live in, it's so label friendly. So,
Oh, yes, yes.
like both you and I clearly are high pitta people. So
Yeah,
everyone assumes you'll be action oriented. So,
right.
and
And
I
that you'll be
assume,
over it quickly.
right. And we ourselves might put that pressure on ourselves, right? On our
Mhm.
individual selves, like, oh, I can do this, I can get through it. There is no getting around grief. It's only getting through it, right? And
Yeah.
so the other thing is being okay with not being okay. Like we don't have to have, and you will know when it's something is really, really off and you do need to talk to a mental health counselor. But for a lot of us, it's these raw phases. In the beginning, one thing feels different.
Yeah.
Then something else feels different. So the one thing I would recommend is try something new. What I mean by that is, after we came back last June, the two cremations, rituals, and all of these deaths happened around my mom's death anniversary. So we basically 3 mornings happening at the same time, right? And we come
Mm,
back, I didn't want to get on the yoga mat because my practice reminded me of, it's not my dad and I practice yoga together, but it's of a world where my parents existed, my new world.
yes.
I didn't want anything familiar. But I also knew it was short lived. But I didn't force myself to think for 1 month I won't do. What I did was I started practicing Kundalini yoga.
Mm,
And so all of last summer, I practiced Kundalini yoga. By the end of summer, like the intensity, and Kundalini is great for releasing all of that heat and intensity. I felt my system calming down. So I was like, okay, now I'm ready to go back to my Hatha yoga. But I wasn't. So even being okay with, just because you were this person before that grief doesn't mean you're going to be this person. Everybody changes, but sometimes I know friends and colleagues and clients who change cities, countries, schools, partners after a loss of a loved one. Grief,
hmm.
that's what it just transforms us on a cellular
Yes.
level.
It really does. Yeah. And I think on the lighter side, I wanted to ask you as well. I thought something that was really beautiful in the book was, you offer up to people, like anyone that we're close to, the most wonderful thing we can offer them is our presence and our
Yes.
understanding and our intention to connect with them. And there's a part in the book where you talk about trying to learn about your parents a little bit more and things like that. But having that communication even after their physical death is gone, and keeping that line of connection open to each other. I think for me, that's been huge. I was adopted, and I met my biological mother when I was 17, and then she passed away in my 30s. But it's weird because I feel her even more now that she's passed
Mm.
on. Like I feel her physical presence, and keeping that relationship open after her physical death has been everything to me and has been really beautiful. So I wondered, like, before physical death and after physical death, what you have to offer for, cultivating deeper relationship with each other, so that when grief does come, even though it will still hurt, we still have something to lean on, that it really soothes us in those moments.
I love, Krista, the fact that you said that the word connection, the way you use it, um, and it's our sole responsibility. I think it's part of our mindful, diligent self care practice to reach out when you're ready. I'm not saying today you've buried, cremated, done the funeral. Tomorrow it's like nope. But like I'll give you an example. I reached out to, and my dad's friends also were like his friends from engineering days. They reached out, and I reciprocated. So I was
Oh,
open to their communication, but with some people, I reached out and they were open. So even though I've done that bashing of your no one is coming to save you, very often people mean well, but they don't know how to approach you. Because, we grief builds a shell around us, and it's very intimidating approaching a person who's grieving because you don't know how much of what they need. And,
or
for
what to
you,
say.
what to say. And for you and I, the work that we do, I think it's a gift and a privilege where I think we're able to access people's needs from a very emotionally intelligent point of view. But I think for a lot of people, they don't know what to say. So they're on the periphery wanting to help you, but they don't know what to do. So I was in Singapore. My brother lives there, and one of my cousins, her kids were visiting from California. And my cousin's daughter, my niece, had pictures on her phone. This young girl had pictures on her phone of me and my brother when we were like 3 or 5 or 6 or something like that. So because I had connected with my cousin who's also lost her parents, this she had those pictures and she shared them with me. So connection might not always be very obvious. It might not always be that uncle or that aunt, because again, that's setting up expectations and setting up room for like heartache and heartbreaks, because people will also surprise you by ghosting you. But then when you are open to the idea of communication, from nowhere, like another cousin of mine, she was like, do you remember you wanted to be an astronaut when you were a little girl? I said, really? She said, I remember you distinctly saying that to my dad. So it's not just the ones you've lost, but it's also the other people and the connection. These are dots, families, dots, connections, old friends. It's important to just reach out, and without the expectations of you will give me a story. But the more comfortable we get with our
Right.
grief, the more comfortable they feel sharing those stories, because they are wondering, if I share this, will that hurt her? Will I be opening up any old wounds? But when you say, what, no, I want to say their name, I want to talk about them. Like we celebrated my dad's birthday, we celebrate my parents, and this will be the first wedding anniversary when they're both gone. My mom's birthday, every year for the last 10 years we've celebrated. So when you do that and you share that with people, it gives them permission to communicate.
Mm-hmm.
Because grief can be very isolating, and grief can be very, mind plays tricks, and it'll make you believe there's no one there for you. But there's someone there for everyone. I think it's very important when you're in the woes of grief and the thick of that sadness to remember, no, there is at least one or two people who are there for you. And we have to make that effort to not go looking for them, to just be open, because, when it's also okay to clear out relationships, and not in a reactive way. I almost feel like for the first 6 to 8 months, don't make any drastic decisions, because
Mm-hmm.
coming from that place of reaction. But after that, if you feel like, what, it's been a year and that friend really never messaged to check in how I was doing, is that even a friendship? Or that uncle or aunt, like, they just haven't even said a hello after you've suffered a loss. So doesn't mean I need to be mean, but maybe they don't deserve as much of my energy. So when you clear up that space, you're
Yeah.
allowing newness in. So because we only have so much bandwidth, right, for emotions, for any of that. So I think being open to transformation is also equally important. Like, there are people wanting to help each one of us, but we have to be ready to take the help.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I follow this on Instagram, some like news story. It's like all they do is report good news stories, and there
Oh,
was one
amazing.
on last week that was talking about how this girl had lost her dad at a really young age as well. And his best friend growing up stepped in, and he was like there for all her pivotal life moments. And so that's alluding to the same thing you're talking about, where like this constellation of connections can happen in grief, and it's this beautiful byproduct that we don't even understand at the time that is even possible. But if you go through this, I think inevitably you come into contact with other people who find a way to support you or be in your life in really unique ways, and that can be such a healing aspect of grief that I think is very unexpected and really beautiful. And I love that you said that.
Thank you. And I think you touched on something very important, because, when you lose a parent or a partner or a sibling, you know yourself through their eyes. So you believe this is the only version of you.
Right.
But, like, as the healing begins, and it's never done, like we talked about earlier, but as the healing begins, and you find more days of joy and fear of sadness, to me, that's a good idea of, healing is moving forward. And you start to realize, no, I am more than that. I am
Mm-hmm.
not just this person who loves, and I'll make this up, like French fries as a 5-year-old. That's what, you're like, oh, I remember you like those French fries. Maybe you've outgrown that. Maybe it's avocado fries that you like, or you don't like fries at all. So it's also permission to look at yourself through your own eyes versus familiar eyes.
Mm.
So grief also gives you that permission to see yourself, evaluate yourself, and view yourself more closely.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think one of the wonderful things about grief is when like you get together with people and then you also hear about yourself through the eyes of the person who's passed away. I think that's also really interesting. When my youngest brother passed away, he was adopted, so I didn't necessarily grow up with him, but we became close when we got reunited. And so his adoptive grandmother at his funeral said something to me about how he saw me in his eyes, and it was like it was such a gift. It was like so beautiful that like he
Wow.
described me in this different way that he would have never verbalized to me, because he was like my brother and a dude, and like they're not real great with their words or their emotions. And it's so interesting that that can happen, and I feel like it's such a gift. I did want to ask you, towards the end of the book, and I think this will be a nice way to wrap up this conversation. You basically say, why you wrote this book, which you've already mentioned about your father and getting this whole thing. So I'd like to think he's here with us in this conversation as well, and just partaking in this beautiful interview. But you said basically to the reader that distilled into all of this is basically acknowledging your grief, finding a way to honor it, and then communicating. So in the vein of those three pillars of the book, is there anything else we would want to say about those three things when we're thinking about grief?
The one last thing, as you go through the grieving process, again, at the start, it's too soon. Find a way to honor their memories. One of the big reasons I wrote this book, Krista, was, of course, my dad wanted me to normalize grief. But I realized, like, we don't talk about the dark side to grief. Like, most literature out there is about, when the person is on the other side and they're reflecting on their journey. I wanted to write something when I was in the midst of it. So the emotions were raw. And then, oh, I look back on it like, okay, I feel better today. So that healing has happened. So there's also that promise of healing does happen if you allow yourself to do that. But again, once you, and I feel like the 5 stages of grief, it's never linear. There's no chronological order. It goes up and down and all of that stuff. So find a way to, and to honor them, because how else? And even I believe in this, like everything is energy, right? It's physics. So
Yes.
where are the people whom we've lost? And I want to believe that they are somewhere around in the form of some energy, because it makes me feel less alone. And it makes you feel more loved, thinking like, your mom or your brother, they're a part of this conversation, right? Like I
Mm-hmm.
feel the same way. I have a picture of my mom and dad in my home office. Like there's a little altar set up, donate to their favorite charities, cook their favorite meals. We have little family get-togethers like on their birthdays, and my aunts and uncles. Like one of my aunts wore a sari that my dad had gifted her for her 50th wedding anniversary, and she's like, I never got to show it to him because he died suddenly. And so I was like, his picture is here, talk to him. I'm like,
Yeah.
what do you lose out? And she was like, no, that does feel good. So it's those little things, find your way to heal yourself. But again, don't be shy to ask for help. Mystical signs, like when I see a butterfly or a pigeon sitting on a windowsill, like, what is that? Or the lights flickering. To me, that's beautiful. It's a way, it's again energy. So you want to call it
Mm-hmm.
physics, you want to call it Reiki, you want to call it like mystical, whatever helps you sleep at
Or
night.
quantum entanglement.
Yes, yes. And whatever helps you heal and sleep better at night. So the 108 tips in this book is about acknowledging the dark side to grief,
Mm.
acknowledging what you might be feeling, and that doesn't make you a bad person for feeling the dark side. Like, it's summer season, families are visiting, and I was talking to a friend, and she's like, how, because my dad used to visit us every summer. She's like, how are you feeling? I said, happy for others, but also a little envious. And she's like, this honesty is what will help you heal. I said, I'm not angry why others are visiting, but I am a little sad that my dad doesn't get to visit. And I
Yeah.
asked my husband, what about you? He said, I feel that too, that my dad doesn't get to visit. So just being honest in your healing journey, because again, the world we live in, it just expects you to say, uh, toxic positivity is a real thing. So,
It is. Yes.
so you can get to the lighter side of things when you've acknowledged the dark within. And we all have Jekyll and Hyde. Please, let's not pretend we are all good. So when we address that, the goodness really comes out, because like, oh, I don't have to mute that voice. There is a 5-year-old child in all of us that wants to be with the sibling, their parent, their grandma, whatever have you, right? So once we've like nurtured and nourished that child, then we can say, okay, now I need to, this is life, I need to honor it for myself and the ones who are no longer here. But we can only do that if we've dealt with the darkness.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that inclusion of them after their physical death is everything. It really helps and makes
Right.
it feel like they're still part of the family, the friendship, like whatever the things are. I really love that you said that. So I'm mindful of the time here. We've got a lot of wonderful questions in about your book, but I want to offer you some space now to tell everybody what you have going on in the next couple months, like how they can get to work with you, where do you hang out on social media, all the things.
Okay, so this is the cover of my book
It's
for anyone who's
beautiful.
curious. And white lotus is considered a sign of healing.
Mm.
So that was the idea. So you can get a copy of the book. I've been doing a lot of book events, but summer is like July, August. Even I want to slow down and work on my healing because, like we were talking about, Krista, the Pitta in me has. I got a doctorate in Ayurveda, completed a business program, and wrote this book inside the last 10 months. So I'm taking this time for true healing. But, I'm Shweta Vikram is where I am at, my first name and last name, on Instagram, LinkedIn, Facebook, X, used to be called Twitter, all of that. So connect with me on there. And I do Ayurvedic coaching. It's, again, you come up with the goals, what you want, and we work through it holistically. So I'm working with clients. I'm taking on new clients this summer because the book work is, I'm like, no, I also need to rest and then pick this up later. So yeah, you feel free to find me, happy to chat, happy to talk. And Ayurveda definitely changed my life. And I'm happy to help anyone on this journey as their guide.
Yeah, that's beautiful. And I always like to end in gratitude and check in with my guests to see what 3 things they're grateful for in this moment, whatever's sort of in your heart chakra.
My breath, because I've been sick and in the ER fighting for my breath. So the fact
Oh
that
my goodness.
I can breathe, I don't take that lightly. Good food, and literally today good food just means avocado egg toast to me, but that's what that nourishment is. It nourishes on a cellular level, and the people I can count on. That list keeps changing. It's ever evolving for all of us, right? So with that comes also health and all of those things. So with food and health to me come together. Like I had an injury, and yesterday was the first day in 3 weeks where I was able to go to the gym and lift weights. So I remind myself it's not the big things that require gratitude. Yes, that, but it's the smaller things of your body healing, your heart healing. And just this conversation with you today, because, these conversations heal me on a deeper level. And I know it helps others also, because grief can make you feel so lonely. And, and when I started to talk about like the dark side to grief, people are like, oh my God, thank God, I thought it was just me. I was like, no, we all deal with these things. So yes, for words, for health, for people, for food and breath.
Beautiful. I love that. What a beautiful way to end. Well, I really appreciate you coming here and spending this hour with me and sharing your work with our listening and watching audience. I know it will help them greatly on their journey. And like we said, grief is one of those things where we're still not in a place where everyone has normalized it yet. So I think anytime we can add to that conversation and to normalize it is adding so much value. So thank you so much for coming to the show, Shweta.
Thank you, Krista, for having me. I love this conversation, and wishing good health and healing to everyone who is going through a difficult phase, or where you feel like you're stuck in your grief.
This podcast was written, directed, and produced by me, your host, Krista Ziomara, in alignment with Light Casting. Music curated and created by Mr. Pixie. You can find I'm Awake Now What on all social media channels by searching IANW Podcast. Head over to your favorite podcast app and subscribe, download, rate, and review. Come back every Sunday to partake in a new and enlightening conversation. May you be filled with love and light until we meet again.